One advantage every African country has in common is that every African country has more than one raw material. One disadvantage every African country, apart from Botswana, suffers is the inability to convert their raw materials into end products locally, and then being able to sell that end product to the consumers. Africa's story is almost the same from country to country. Africans have raw material assets that largely, we don't know what to do with them. Foreigners come into Africa. They buy, take, or are given access to the raw materials. They export it to their country, turn the raw materials into end products. Sell it for huge profits and in some cases sell it back to Africa. As Africans, we complain that those raw materials converted into end products belong to us or that we are owed a percentage of the profit. Is that a legitimate claim? Are we entitled to profits we did not work for? It is highly likely you have heard African leaders and businesses talk about how and why African raw materials should benefit Africa as our moral right. Is this even a legitimate demand? Is there such a thing? Do we ask ourselves why we can't take part in the value chain to create the end product? The answer is not as straightforward as it sounds and requires a lot more intelligence. We have seen African raw materials be a curse to the communities they come from, however, can they also be a blessing? This video will demonstrate some of these points based on the research we have conducted. We have broken the topics into 4 key parts. The first part will discuss why Africa cannot convert its raw materials into end products. It is essential for us to understand our strengths and weaknesses. The second part will discuss the raw materials ecosystem and demonstrate why African raw materials do not benefit Africans and why Africa is left out of the raw materials ecosystem. The third section will show you how intellectual property rights works in raw materials and provide a comparison between 2 coffee-producing countries, Kenya and Colombia. The last section will address why Africans need to become intellectual if we are to become like other nations that have used their raw materials to develop their own countries. As we say in Swahili, tuingie ndani yake. Let's get into it. There are certain fundamental reasons why Africa will not be able to convert its raw materials to end products, and some of the reasons are: 1. Africa is not industrialized. A significant amount of industrialization is required to convert raw materials into end products, and this is largely absent in African countries with significant raw materials. As a result, it is easier for them to sell the raw materials than worry about fixing systemic issues that has plagued Africa for decades. 2. Demand for these raw materials are not in Africa in comparison to international markets. Many people confuse this topic. When we say demand, we do not mean the consumers of the product, but rather we mean the buyer who is willing to travel to where the raw material is located to make a purchase. Nigeria and Cameroon are neighbors, but you will find more international raw materials buyers in Cameroon than you would find Nigerian raw materials buyers. This is mainly because international buyers have a higher buying power comparatively speaking. 3. Intra-Africa trade is very difficult, and as a result, it is cheaper to get raw materials from Cameroon to France than it is from Nigeria to Cameroon. 4. Naturally, it is easier and cheaper to sell raw materials than end products. This is mainly because farming is less intensive than manufacturing. Farming requires less energy, and once the raw material is produced, the farmer's job is done. The next key challenge is logistics to get the raw materials to the factory. This is usually a headache for the buyer. The conversion of raw materials to end products is intellectually challenging the higher up you go in the value chain. Many people that criticize Africa on its inability to create end products in Africa underestimate the amount of intellectual processes that is required to produce an end product to a market and meet all the market requirements. By way of example, if an African farmer wants to sell his or her end product to 10 countries, He or she has to speak the languages in those countries, hire people in each country to negotiate for him, and have consultants to localize his products in those 10 countries. All this before he sees a penny of profit. One must not forget that the average African farmer may not even have a passport, let alone be able to get a visa to these countries. Lastly, the consumer market dictates the end product and demand for it. By this we mean, Greek retailers will often dictate what products they want to sell to their Greek customers in Greece, and very often will be very specific on the look and feel of the product. Italian, French, American, and Swiss buyers will do exactly the same. For each market, an end product is to be sold in, a whole industry needs to be set up, with marketing strategies, sales offices, and points of presence. In conclusion, the reason Africa cannot convert its raw materials to end products are major market issues that Africa cannot fix overnight. They are deep-rooted issues that Africa may never solve. If you think about any raw materials and their end products, it will not be surprising to conclude that they almost operate in two separate worlds. Take a look at cocoa and chocolate and you will realize that the skills and expertise needed for cocoa farming is almost totally different from that needed for chocolate. The journey for raw materials starts with a producer or farmer who plants the raw materials. He or she will be hoping to harvest after, in some cases, months of nurturing the plant. At this point, he or she will almost certainly just want to sell for cash and nothing more. They will need that cash to start planting again and feeding their families. As a result, they will not be interested in any talk about value chain development. All they will want is cash. The buyer of the raw materials comes into the picture next. They operate with cash only and will hunt down these raw materials wherever they are. They will be taking their money and finding out where the raw materials exist and making the effort to go and buy them. Note here that the buyer is the one going to find the seller. This means this is where all talks about Africa benefiting from their raw materials end. The buyers will also be worrying about delivery to the factory where the manufacturing will take place. This is why you have not seen good roads where raw materials exist in Africa, because farmer is not thinking beyond selling the produce, and it is the buyer that has to take the delivery of the purchase. The buyer will only operate on the basis of demand and supply. No one buys a produce if there is no demand for it. The buyer will expect to make a profit at this stage. The factory where the raw materials will be deposited to be processed is going to be located as close to where they will be sold as possible. This is in order that they can deliver to the consumers. This manufacturer has to think about product design. You will notice that other than selling the concept of Africa here, there is no obligation to the African community that the raw materials came from. At this point, no one in the ecosystem is thinking about Africa. As far as they are concerned, Africa has been paid for the deal and they would not care about the community that the raw materials came from. The next phase of the ecosystem is the retailer, who are the people that will house the products until a consumer will come to their shops and purchase the goods. This is where the consumers come into play. This is where the money is made and ultimately the key decision maker in this ecosystem. What the consumer wants will dictate the entire ecosystem, and you will notice Africa is a distant thought at this point. In conclusion, by design, Africa is not meant to benefit from its raw materials other than selling the raw materials to the buyer. Now consider all the talks you have heard about Africa being able to benefit from its raw materials and look at this ecosystem. It becomes clear, doesn't it, that all the talks were just empty gestures and grandstanding. They were never meant to work. What is the Developing Africa Group's intellectual property rights strategy for raw materials? The best way to describe our strategy is to compare two raw materials from two countries: Kenyan coffee and Colombian coffee. At the top of this image you will see that Colombia coffee developed 10 times more than its Kenyan counterpart. Café de Colombia protects all the farmers in their country that grow coffee. Almost all these people are multimillionaires in dollars. Kenyan does have a coffee board, but in general Kenyan coffee is still treated purely like a raw material producer. Kenya has no input other than in the selling of the coffee beans. Café de Colombia is so advanced intellectually that it has its trademarks registered within the EU. And within the same database, there was no entry for Kenyan coffee. Café de Colombia has GI, geographical indicators, registered in Europe. The GIs represent the link between the quality of a product and its origin, thus fulfilling a promise of quality and tradition to customers and consumers. In this way, they represent an instrument of legal protection, which guarantees that the products described as coming from a region fully comply with the strict requirements of quality and origin. These products are also directly linked to the effort of the community belonging to that region or country and whose effort must be recognized and valued. Café de Colombia has a brand called Juan Valdez across the country, and it is a coffee chain that sells Colombia coffee across Colombia. By contrast, international brands have taken over Kenyan coffee, and this has meant Kenya coffee producers will always be treated as farmers, whereas Café de Colombia coffee owners own the entire value chain, including an international presence to expand their market internationally. There is no similar footprint for Kenyan coffee, and the mention of the name Kenyan coffee is almost always by international brands who has hijacked the name. The difference here is that the coffee from Colombia has made its farmers and communities very rich whilst creating a lot of employment in coffee shops. Whereas Kenyan coffee is still very much creating rich farmers and nothing more. If Africa is to take control of its raw materials, it needs to adopt the Colombian approach across the continent. One has to look at Colombia to see to what extent smart intellectual decisions of its raw materials has created revenue for major road infrastructures to be built, making its raw materials a blessing to its citizens. Whilst we are not saying Colombia has sorted out all its problems, we are certainly saying it is doing 10 times better than any African country with abundant raw materials. Africa needs to lead the raw materials game intellectually. It may not be possible in our lifetime to industrialize Africa, but it is certainly possible in the next 10 years to enable African raw materials to start benefiting African communities. The only way Africa can do that is to implement a raw materials intellectual property rights commercialization strategy that can be applied across the continent.